She called the police. I called my attorney. I was unloading gear. Hadn't even popped open the back hatch when she pulled up clipboard and hand lecturing me about HOA compliance. Like I'd wandered into her cul-de-sac. I told her this was private property. She laughed, claiming everything out here fell under community rules. Though she wouldn't say who exactly enforced them, I shrugged it off until days later. That's when I spotted a ticket taped to my shed, a drone circling above my roof, and a citation accusing me of cutting an unauthorized trail that deer supposedly used. I don't know anymore. This place just feels wrong now. What would you have done if someone tried to lay claim to your land? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning. I'd just driven out to my recently purchased 190 acres with a truck packed full of surveying equipment. Name's Luke Porter, 38, County Forester, which means when it comes to woodland property, I know exactly what ownership looks like on paper and on the ground. I'd picked up this land 3 weeks earlier at a county auction, cash in hand, fair and square, former surplus state property, clean deed, clearly marked boundaries, everything legal. Or so I believed until I met Paula. She came striding down the dirt access road like she ran the place, wearing what looked like a crossing guard vest with HOA security scribbled across it in marker. Paula Cra 52, if the local chatter is true, was apparently the self-appointed president of the Homeowners Association nearby. Clipboard hugged to her chest. She radiated that stubborn authority you only get from bulldozing your way through arguments for years. "Excuse me, you can't park here," she barked before I'd even shut off the engine. "This is HOA property. You're trespassing." I climbed out of my truck, looking over the woods I legally owned. Massive oaks stretched overhead, sunlight breaking into mottled patches on the forest floor. A narrow walking path wound between them, marked with little wooden signs that read, "Community Nature Path," and there Paula stood, planted right at the trail entrance, arms crossed like a guard at the gate. "I'm Luke Porter," I told her, pulling the folded deed from my jacket. "This land is mine now. Bought it from the county 3 weeks ago." Her eyes widened for maybe 2 seconds before sharpening into pure fury. "Impossible," she snapped. Yanking the papers from my hand, she skimmed the legal description with the desperation of someone hunting for a typo that would blow up the whole deal. "This says you own everything from the main road to Deer Creek. That includes our trail and our picnic area." She looked at me as if I'd just stolen Christmas. "That's correct," I replied, taking the deed back and folding it carefully. "The county sold it off as surplus. I won the auction. The title is clear." What I didn't mention was how long I'd been eyeing this property, waiting for the day it went up for sale. As a forester, I knew this land had rare conservation value: hardwood forest, a seasonal creek, wildlife corridors. Exactly the kind of place worth preserving. Paula's face went through several shades before settling on furious red. "You can't just buy community land and push out residents who've used it for years," she declared. "We've maintained those trails, installed picnic tables and benches. We built a space for families. You can't just wipe that out." Her passion was clear, even if completely misplaced. "I don't plan to destroy anything," I told her evenly, "but I do own this property now, which means any improvements or upkeep require my approval." From the truck bed, I pulled a hammer and laminated copies of my deed and survey maps. "I'm posting these at the trailhead. That way there's no confusion." The sound of nails sinking into oak echoed through the forest as I mounted the documents. Paula watched like I'd just graffitied the Sistine Chapel. "You can't do that," she shrieked, her voice high enough to scatter every bird for a quarter mile. "This land is zoned for community use. We have approval." That's when I noticed something beneath the leaves: old concrete survey markers, half buried. Not flimsy wooden stakes like Paula's trail had, but the real kind, set by county surveyors decades ago. I made a mental note to uncover them later, to confirm every boundary line. "I'm not in your HOA," I told her firmly. "Never have been, never will be. This land is mine. If you want access, you'll need to ask permission." Her mouth worked silently, like her whole worldview was collapsing in front of her. At last she found her voice again. "This isn't over," she spat. With all the melodrama of a soap opera villain, I'm calling my lawyer and the county planning office. We'll see how long this little stunt lasts. I watched her march back toward the subdivision, that homemade vest flapping behind her like a cape. For a second, I wondered if I'd been too harsh. Maybe there was room for compromise, some arrangement where neighbors could still use the trail while respecting my ownership. But the way Paula assumed she could bulldoze my rights with nothing but attitude rubbed me raw. That evening, my surveyor sent over an email, short, ominous. Luke found some issues with the boundary markers. Out there, the old concrete markers don't line up with the wooden stakes that currently outline the trail system. I think we need to figure out what's really where. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I stared at that email for longer than I should have, trying to understand what exactly I'd walked into. Buying the land had seemed simple enough: county auction, clean title, no liens, no hidden problems. But clearly Paula and her husband had very different opinions about where the property lines fell, and if today's confrontation had shown me anything, it was that she wasn't about to surrender her supposed territory quietly. Still, that email turned out to be just the first clue to something much bigger. The next morning, a certified letter appeared in my mailbox, and it made Paula's dramatic exit the day before seem almost reasonable. The envelope was addressed to current illegal occupant at my home address, already a bad sign. Inside was a so-called demand notice, dressed up with the letterhead of Woodland Hills Community Association Legal Department. At first glance, it looked official, but the details gave it away: wrong fonts, duplicated dates in the header, and a return address leading only to some random P.O. box. According to this amateur attempt at legal intimidation, I owed $400 in unpaid forestry maintenance fees going back 3 years. The kicker? 3 years before I'd even known this property existed. Supposedly, I was delinquent on dues to an HOA I'd never joined, for land I hadn't even owned. The letter threatened immediate legal action and the seizure of my property if I didn't pay within 10 business days. It was signed by none other than Paula Crowell, president and legal representative. I was still laughing at the absurd threat when there was a knock at my door. My neighbor, Nate Jensen, stood there. Nate lived in the house nearest to the Forest Trail entrance. Quiet guy, mid-40s, worked remotely in some programming job. I'd seen him walking his dog along the disputed path, but we'd never spoken until then. "Hey, Luke," he said, glancing over his shoulder like he was afraid of being spotted. "Can we talk privately about this whole HOA situation?" We ended up on my back porch. Nate pulled out his phone and started scrolling through screenshots. "I've been keeping track of Paula's behavior for months," he said in a low voice. "She's been pulling the same tricks on other residents, but no one wants to call her out. She makes life hell for anyone who pushes back." He showed me images of HOA financial records he'd somehow obtained, payments labeled as trail maintenance, fees, community improvement assessments, emergency landscaping costs, all funneling straight into Paula's personal bank account. Not any HOA account. "Wait," I said, staring at the routing numbers. "These funds aren't going to the HOA at all. They're going directly to her checking account." Nate nodded grimly. "That's not even the worst of it." He swiped to another batch of documents, HOA meeting minutes spanning 2 years. Every single page lacked the required treasurer's signature. Without a treasurer's approval, none of those fees were legally binding. The deeper we dug into his records, the clearer it became. Paula was running a full-blown scam. She'd pocketed over $3,000 from neighbors in just the past year and a half, claiming it was for improvements to common areas that either didn't exist or weren't HOA property at all. "She tried it with my yard too," Nate said, showing me photos of his property line. "Claimed part of my garden was actually community land, then tried to charge me rent for using my own soil." I stared at the evidence, a mix of outrage and disbelief rising in me. "How did you even get all this?" Nate looked uncomfortable. "I used to be married to Paula's bookkeeper before they fell out last year. She'd complain about being told to falsify records. When Paula fired her, she kept copies of everything as protection." The scope of Paula's forged paper trail was staggering. She'd manufactured official-looking invoices for maintenance work that was never done. She'd billed neighbors for community improvements that existed only on paper. She'd even convinced some to pay emergency tree removal fees though. The supposedly hazardous trees were perfectly healthy and still standing. But this is what really matters, Nate said, scrolling again, this time to a chain of emails. She's not just running petty scams, she's planning something bigger. The emails showed Paula discussing development projects with contractors, bragging about having development rights to my forest land. They talked about site prep for luxury amenities, strategizing around the trail to maximize buildable area. My stomach sank as I read. This wasn't about a few $100s in fake fees. She was actively planning construction on property she didn't own, funded by money she'd stolen from neighbors, all for her personal gain. She's deeper in this than I thought, I muttered, scrolling through screenshot after screenshot of proof. The evidence was overwhelming, yet I couldn't shake the sense that something was missing. Paula had been too confident yesterday, too sure of herself. People don't usually fight this hard unless they think they've got an ace hidden up their sleeve. Nate, I asked slowly, do you think Paula really believes she has some legal claim to this land? Or is she just making noise, hoping? I'll fold. Nate was silent for a while, gazing out toward the forest. Finally, he said honestly, I think she convinces herself that if she acts like she owns something long enough, it just becomes hers. She's done it with people's property. She's done it with HOA funds. Now she's trying it with your forest. The scary part is how many neighbors she's managed to rope into believing her. As Nate packed up his phone and left, I couldn't stop thinking about what larger plan Paula was hiding. The fake fees and bogus records were bad enough, but the contract emails suggested something far bigger, something that went beyond neighborhood bullying. I walked Nate to his car, both of us scanning the shadows like we were part of some underground resistance movement against HOA tyranny. The evening air carried the heavy weight of everything we'd uncovered. I kept circling back to those emails, the way she spoke about development rights, like she really owned them, the absolute certainty in her threats of legal action. Either she was delusional, or she had some kind of card to play that I hadn't uncovered yet. I was betting on the latter, and the thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. That night, I spread every property document I owned across my kitchen table, combing through them line by line. The deed was airtight. The survey was legitimate. The auction process had been above board. Still, I couldn't shake the thought, people like Paula don't spend money on fake letterhead and contractor consultations unless they think they have a real chance at winning. And the next morning, I would learn just how right I was. 2 days later, Paula called an emergency HOA meeting, not at the community center, not in anyone's living room. Instead, she staged it right at the edge of my forest lot, where the main trail began. She'd arranged folding chairs in a semicircle, facing the trees, almost like she was directing some kind of outdoor play. A piece of poster board propped up nearby read, in her bold block handwriting, "Emergency community meeting regarding illegal land seizure." I had to admit, the theatrics were nearly impressive if you ignored the fact that she was literally trespassing on my property to pull it off. I showed up early and hung back near the rear row, curious how many neighbors would actually show for this production. About 15 drifted over from the subdivision, most wearing puzzled expressions as they sat in chairs beside the forest, instead of in someone's den. I recognized a handful of faces from brief encounters around the neighborhood, but one woman stood out immediately. She carried herself with the steady authority of someone who had weathered years of neighborhood disputes. She studied Paula's setup with a skepticism that was impossible to miss. Before things officially began, I decided to check something that had been nagging me since yesterday. Paula had nailed a new sign to one of the oaks near the trailhead. It read, "Private HOA Park, green paint on white wood." I pressed a tissue against one corner. Wet paint smeared off instantly, staining the tissue bright green. Fresh. Paula must have painted it just yesterday or this very morning, probably right after our clash over ownership. Then, Paula rose from her chair like she was about to brief the United Nations. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, sweeping her arm toward the trees. "Our community is under attack. A hostile outsider has illegally seized control of our beloved forest. Preserve and plans to destroy everything we've built together." She gestured dramatically in my direction, Luke Porter claims he owns this land, but what he's really doing is hiding his plan to sell our forest to developers. Several heads swiveled toward me. Confusion and unease spread through the group. Clearly, Paula had already been working on them, because a few nodded along like they'd heard this tale before. He's posted fake ownership papers. She pressed on, pointing at the laminated deeds still tacked to the tree. And he's trying to scare residents into paying him instead of their rightful HOA dues. That's when the woman I'd noticed earlier stood. Her voice carried instant weight. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm Nora Riss. I've lived here 12 years. Before we throw accusations around, we need actual documentation. Paula, can you show us the original HOA charter that proves we own this forest?" It was like watching a poker bluff get called. Paula's confident act faltered. "The charter is being updated by our legal team," she said quickly. "But we do have established use rights going back years. That sets a precedent for community ownership." I had to admit she had a talent for dressing nonsense up to sound nearly convincing, actually. I said, standing, "I can clear this up." I pulled out my phone and showed the photos I'd taken of the buried survey markers. These are original county survey posts installed when the land was first mapped. Government markers, not wooden stakes. I zoomed in on the concrete bases capped with metal. "And according to these markers, your trail sits entirely on land I legally purchased from the county." The shift in the crowd was immediate. Murmurs spread. People glanced back and forth between my phone and Paula's handmade signs. Nora stepped forward to examine the photos. After a long look, she nodded. "These appear authentic. Do you also have the official property survey that goes with them?" I handed her the surveyor's report complete with legal descriptions and professional measurements. As she read, Paula's composure cracked in real time. "Those markers were moved by vandals," she blurted. "Our newer stakes were installed by our landscape maintenance team. Those are the real property lines." "Your landscape maintenance team," Nora repeated slowly. "The same team charging us for trail upkeep?" She looked up from my documents with the sharp recognition of someone connecting the final pieces of a puzzle. "Paula, are you saying the same people collecting money from us also moved official government survey markers?" Silence dropped like a weight. Paula opened and closed her mouth several times without words forming. Finally, she managed, "We've invested too much in this community space to let an outsider ruin it. Those markers could have been put there by anyone. County survey posts are federal property." I said evenly, "Moving or tampering with them is a crime. And beyond that, I have the county auction receipt, the deed transfer, and a clean title search." I gestured toward the woods. "This was never whole land. It was county property. I simply bought it." Nora handed my papers back with a firm nod. "This all looks legitimate," she told the group. And honestly, it shed a lot of light on why our HOA dues keep climbing even though we never actually see improvements to the shared spaces. She turned toward Paula and said firmly, "We need to have a real conversation about financial transparency and exactly where our money is going." From there, the meeting unraveled fast. Residents began pressing with sharp questions about how the trail maintenance funds had been used. Others demanded to know why Paula was holding community gatherings on private property without asking permission. A few attendees got up and walked out, shaking their heads in sheer frustration. Through it all, Paula kept repeating that she was protecting the neighborhood from outside threats, but her voice grew thinner and more frantic every time she tried to explain. As the crowd thinned, Nora came over to me quietly. "I've had doubts about Paula's financial handling for months," she admitted in a low voice. She glanced back toward Paula, who was hastily folding chairs with the forced energy of someone pretending the evening had been a triumph. "This property dispute might be exactly what sparks a push for real oversight of the HOA funds," Nora added. Then, almost to herself, "I doubt this ends peacefully." I watched Paula load the chairs into her car, avoiding eye contact with anyone still pressing for receipts or explanations. The confident authority she'd displayed at the beginning was gone, replaced by the jittery movements of someone who knows their story is unraveling, but doesn't know how to stop the collapse. The real battle was only just beginning. That night, I lay awake, unable to shake the look of desperation on her face. This wasn't ordinary neighborhood squabbling. People don't pour this much energy into fake signs and sudden meetings unless they're protecting something bigger than access to a trail. My mind kept circling back to the contractor emails Nate had shown me, and to Paula's unwavering threats of legal action. Either she was completely detached from reality, or there was a deeper layer I hadn't yet uncovered. By 3 a.m, I gave up trying to sleep and decided to check the wildlife camera I'd set up near the property line the week before. I had originally installed it just to monitor deer movement, but with everything going on, I was curious if anyone had been creeping around after dark. The motion-activated camera with night vision should have caught anything. What I found on the memory card made my pulse spike dangerously. Paula had been busy. Footage from the nights earlier showed her sneaking onto my property around midnight, carrying a small shovel and a canvas bag. She wasn't just moving trail signs, she was digging. I watched in grainy black and white as she buried wooden stakes wrapped in reflective tape, just a few feet away from the real boundary markers. The realization hit hard. Paula wasn't merely arguing about property lines, she was fabricating evidence to back up her claims. Those newer markers she bragged about at the meeting, supposedly placed by professional landscaping crews, were fakes she had planted herself in the middle of the night. The level of planning was chilling. The rest of the early morning, I spent leaving urgent voicemails at the county planning office, hoping someone could confirm permit records. When the office opened at 8, I was on the line immediately. I need to verify development permits for property number 478 to 92, I told the clerk. The reply was blunt and conclusive. No permits existed. Nothing pending, nothing filed, nothing approved. Paula had been scheming to build on land she didn't even own. But that's when the bigger problem set in. Was I even prepared to fight this properly? Legal disputes cost money, time, and no small amount of peace of mind. I'd bought this forest as a retreat, a quiet place to focus on conservation without red tape or office politics. Instead, I was staring down a drawn-out confrontation with someone apparently willing to break laws to get what she wanted. A part of me wondered if I should just walk away, sell, and find a place without hostile neighbors and fraudulent HOA claims. The stress was already wearing me down. I found myself double-checking door locks at night, something I'd never done before. Paula's midnight stunts suggested she wasn't the type to be deterred by paperwork or court orders. People who sneak around planting fake evidence are people who escalate. I'd seen land disputes in my work with the forestry department before, but they were usually straightforward fights over timber rights or easements. This felt far more personal, more malicious. Paula wasn't just mistaken, she was actively undermining the law. And based on Nate's financial records, she had sunk serious money into whatever scheme she was running. The whole thing reminded me of a case I'd once shared in forums about a landowner who tried to take over state park land by camping there illegally for years. That dragged on for 18 months and cost the state thousands in legal fees. But I had never seen anything as brazen as Paula's tactics, charging neighbors fraudulent fees while planning illegal construction on property that wasn't hers. When Officer Ruiz arrived in response to my trespassing report, he studied the timestamp footage carefully, reviewing the GPS coordinates recorded by the camera. Well, he said at last, this absolutely qualifies as criminal trespass. And messing with survey markers, that's another offense altogether. He froze the video at the exact moment Paula was seen pushing wooden stakes into the ground. But here's the catch: we'd have to settle the property dispute before any criminal charges could actually stick. What do you mean? I asked, though I already suspected where he was headed. Officer Ruiz shifted uneasily. Look, your ownership papers look legitimate, no question. But Ms. Crail has been phoning our office nonstop, insisting that you're the trespasser, that you're the one vandalizing community land. Until a judge makes a ruling on the boundaries, we're in limbo. The reality hit me hard. Even with documents in hand and video proof of Paula burying stakes, the system was deliberately slow and cautious. Her plan wasn't just to claim my property, it was to stir up enough legal uncertainty to stall everything, buying her time to push forward with whatever construction she had in mind. So what now? I asked. Closing his notebook, Officer Ruiz gazed at the forest ground zero of the whole mess. "Nobody touches a thing until this is resolved," he said firmly. "No more digging. No more posting signs. No more gatherings on contested land. The county will determine ownership, and only then can we look at possible criminal charges." As his patrol car disappeared down the access road, Paula's smug confidence at yesterday's meeting finally made sense. She wasn't banking on ownership rights. She was counting on bureaucracy dragging its feet long enough for her to finish whatever she'd started. Fake fees, forged paperwork, planted evidence. It was all part of a strategy to stall while construction quietly moved forward. I felt cornered, forced into defense in a game where I barely understood the rules. But maybe there was an opening here. If she pushed ahead with building, she'd need trucks, materials, contractors, all things that could be documented. And judging by her midnight activity, desperation might drive her into mistakes that would reveal her whole scheme. The real question was whether I had the patience and resources to outlast someone so willing to break the law, and whether I was ready for the conflict to get worse before it got better. The next day brought answers I hadn't expected. I was at the post office picking up mail when Mrs. Taylor from the local pharmacy approached, clutching a manila envelope. Under her arm, she glanced around like we were sharing state secrets. "You're the one with the forest property, right?" she asked in a low voice. "I think you need to see this." She handed me the envelope with a careful urgency that told me it mattered. Inside were glossy, full-color flyers, "Woodland Luxury Retreat." The headline announced an elegant script, opening soon in the heart of nature's paradise. The images showed picturesque renderings of cabins among trees, a spa pavilion by the creek, and smiling guests in yoga sessions set unmistakably in my forest. At the bottom, in small print, was Paula's name as project director along with a number for advance bookings. My hands trembled as I read. This wasn't a minor project. Paula was promoting a full-scale commercial retreat center, cabins, wellness facilities, overnight stays, guided activities. The brochure promised private access to untouched woodland trails and top-tier amenities. The grand opening date was printed inside. It was next month. "Where did you get this?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Mrs. Taylor looked uncomfortable. "My daughter works at a printing company downtown. They just finished a rush order for these." She noticed the listed address was your forest and thought it strange. Knowing you'd only just bought the land, she gave me a copy to show you. The sheer scope of Paula's deception floored me. While she fought me over trail rights and collected bogus maintenance fees from neighbors, she had been quietly advertising a luxury development on land she didn't own. The money alone, marketing campaigns, reservations, contractor consultations proved this had been in the works for months, long before our dispute began. And there was more. Mrs. Taylor dug into her purse and produced a folded sheet. "This was attached to the flyers," she said. "Looks like some kind of contractor note." It was a printed email discussing site prep for luxury facilities, including how to work around the shared access trail to maximize buildable space. The contractor's estimate covered foundation work for multiple structures, utilities, and landscaping. Reading the specs made my stomach sink. Paula wasn't just planning cabins. She wanted a main lodge with a commercial kitchen, individual cottages with bathrooms, a spa facility, even a corporate event pavilion. The build schedule projected 8 months, with the first phase kicking off right after property acquisition. That afternoon, I dug deeper. If she was already advertising bookings, there had to be a paper trail, payments, business filings, maybe permits under false addresses. The county licensing office gave me exactly that. Once I explained the situation, the clerk searched records and uncovered a business registration, Woodland Luxury Retreats, LLC, filed 6 months ago with Paula listed as managing partner. But the business address wasn't my forest. It pointed to a parcel 10 miles away, land belonging to the state park system. She had registered her venture with public land coordinates, probably betting nobody would notice until after she was operational. Worse still, she'd already been taking advance deposits. The registration included a tax ID, which meant she was reporting income as though it were legitimate. People had paid real money for reservations at a retreat that didn't exist, on land she didn't own, with permits that were never issued. That evening Nate dropped by with more troubling news. "She's been going door to door," he said, showing me texts from neighbors, telling everyone you're planning to clear-cut the forest and put up a shopping center. She's urging local residents to sign a petition calling for an emergency injunction to block your development permits. He hesitated before speaking again, and what he said next unsettled me. I need to admit something. I wasn't entirely truthful before. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. His expression was full of shame. "Last year, Paula talked me into helping her get a neighbor's backyard reclassified as a protected wetland. It wasn't really wetland, but it was enough to stall their deck renovation for months. We both knew it was bogus. The confession lingered heavily between us. "Why didn't you say something then?" I asked slowly. He looked torn. "Because Paula framed it like we were safeguarding the neighborhood from overdevelopment. She has a way of convincing people that her schemes are really for the greater good." The silence between us grew uncomfortable until he finally went on. "At least a dozen families have already signed her petition, maybe more. She's been pushing the environmental threat angle, and she's persuasive." The petition itself was a trap of clever wording. It spoke of saving green space and defending community recreation areas from commercial exploitation. Anyone skimming it would assume they were standing up for environmental conservation. In reality, their signature could be used to challenge my rightful property ownership in court. "Do you think this is too much of a gamble?" I asked, my own doubts creeping in. Paula clearly had deeper roots in the community than I'd anticipated. She'd been planning her retreat project for far longer than I realized. She had paying clients lined up, business registrations in place, and now a petition filled with neighbor support. Meanwhile, all I had were my legal deeds and a stack of evidence that nobody seemed interested in looking at. But as I sat in my kitchen that night, reviewing every document I gathered, something became obvious. Paula's confidence wasn't just about having a business plan or community backing. She was betting on delay and confusion. If she could stall any official decision long enough, she might get enough construction done that shutting her down would become politically messy. Suddenly, the timeline in her glossy brochures made sense. A grand opening set for next month meant building had to begin immediately. And if she was bold enough to accept customer deposits for a business that didn't legally exist, she might also be reckless enough to start building without permits or proper ownership. I realized her next move could bring this fight into the open in a way that left no middle ground. Instead of attacking her misinformation directly, I chose another strategy: complete transparency. I emailed every resident I could find, inviting them to a guided walk through the forest. I promised to explain my conservation plans, show proof of ownership, and answer any questions. The invitation stressed this wasn't political, it was about education, especially for kids who wanted to learn about local wildlife. County permits were up for review in 3 days if we didn't act fast. Paula's trail project could break ground first. To my surprise, about 20 people showed up that Saturday morning. Several brought their children, curious about the ecology of the forest. Word had spread online, and it was clear many neighbors were fed up with Paula's aggressive tactics. I'd brought my professional tools, surveying equipment, soil kits, habitat assessment materials, the instruments of real conservation work. This wasn't about lawsuits or HOA disputes. This was about showing what I genuinely cared about. We began at the trailhead, where I explained how the county's survey established the legal boundaries of my property. I showed them my deed and survey papers, but I also spoke about the ecological importance of the hardwood forest, its wildlife corridors, and its role in the larger ecosystem. The kids loved seeing how I tested soil and measured tree health. Parents asked about my background in forestry and how I planned to maintain the trails. It didn't take long to see what mattered most to them. They weren't interested in legal technicalities. They just wanted the forest preserved and open to the community. "So, you're not planning to put any kind of commercial development here?" one father asked while his daughter played by the creek. "Because that petition going around says a shopping center's in the works." I saw real worry in his face, and anger flared again at Paula's lies. No commercial development. I said firmly, my only goal is to keep this land as a conservation area for responsible community use. I'm a county forester. Protecting ecosystems is literally my job. I gestured to the canopy above us. This forest is one of the richest habitats in the county. The last thing I'd do is destroy it for profit. But then the tour took a startling turn. As we walked toward the seasonal creek, a neighbor pointed out professional-grade surveying equipment scattered across the property. Gear that wasn't mine. Tripods and instruments were set up at key points marked with a local surveying firm's tags and project numbers. The grid patterns being mapped had nothing to do with conservation. They were for large-scale construction. The scope suggested millions in planned development. Before I could fully process this, the tone of the gathering shifted. Margaret, a quiet woman I barely knew, stepped forward, eyes brimming with tears. Paula fined my disabled son for using a mobility ramp we hadn't gotten approved, she said softly. She forced him to remove it and use the back door for 3 months while we appealed. He's 16 and in a wheelchair. The group fell into silence, and I could see the anger simmering across several faces. A retired accountant finally spoke, his voice clipped with precision. I've tracked the HOA's expenses for 2 years, and the math doesn't work. We've paid more than $15,000 in special assessments, but there are no receipts for actual improvements to community property. An older man gave a grave nod. Paula humiliated my wife at a board meeting last year, called her a troublemaker in front of 30 people just for asking about the budget. I pulled a folder from under my arm and spread out drone photos across a picnic table. These images prove multiple HOA structures have been built over the legal property lines, I said. Pointing out the clear violations, a resident leaned in close, whispering, "That's the playground. That's sitting on your land." The realization swept through the group instantly. From the back, someone asked nervously, "What if Paula sues us for supporting you?" The concern was genuine. I could see the hesitation creeping into their expressions. "I've already filed a motion with the county," I explained calmly. "They're investigating the HOA's financial irregularities and boundary violations. Anyone who's been charged illegal fees or hit with false violations has legal protection as a witness." As I watched families study the evidence and share their own HOA horror stories, it struck me this fight had grown beyond property lines. As a county forester, I understood firsthand the environmental toll unauthorized construction brings, especially in fragile ecosystems like this hardwood forest. Safeguarding this land wasn't just a legal duty anymore. It had become personal. The wildlife corridors, the seasonal creek bed, the mature tree canopy that takes decades to grow. Paula's retreat center would wipe them out in a way that could never be restored in my lifetime. "Tomorrow, I'm filing for an injunction," I announced. "If the county stalls, I'll hold a press conference at the trailhead." The response was immediate. Neighbors offered to testify. Others volunteered to document any further encroachments. For the first time since this battle began, I felt like I wasn't standing alone against Paula's propaganda machine. I had real community support. As people prepared to leave, several thanked me for the presentation and said they felt relief knowing the forest would be defended. But Nora lingered, her eyes fixed on the survey equipment with visible unease. "Luke," she said quietly, "I think Paula's planning something much bigger than a dedication ceremony. The setup looks like preparation for construction, not just a PR stunt." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already suspected where this was going. She pointed toward the creek, where survey markers formed a geometric layout. "Those instruments are for foundation work. My ex-husband was a contractor. I recognized the pattern. Someone's preparing to build permanent structures here, probably within weeks." That evening, a phone call confirmed my worst fears. Officer Ruiz told me a local surveying company had contacted him. They'd been hired to draft site plans for a commercial retreat facility. But when they cross-checked property records, nothing aligned. "They're asking if there's a legal dispute they need to be aware of," he said. Suddenly, Paula's confidence throughout all this made sense. The fake fees, the misleading petition, the professional surveys, it was all part of a strategy to fabricate legitimacy while pushing construction forward. Later that night, I stepped outside and found neon orange survey flags planted along my property line. One marked with Paula's initials and the whole logo. The boldness of it stunned me. The final confrontation was coming, but this time I had the community at my side. Paula's desperation hit its peak on a crisp Thursday morning. I woke to the roar of heavy machinery moving through the forest. From my window, I spotted a small excavator rolling down the trail, followed by a pickup full of building materials. Behind them came a procession of cars carrying what looked like local officials, investors, and photographers. Paula was staging her dedication ceremony, legal or not. I threw on clothes and ran to the entrance of the forest, where a surreal scene unfolded. A temporary pavilion stood decorated with balloons and banners proclaiming Woodland Luxury Retreat Grand Dedication. A catering truck was setting up food stations, while a politician rehearsed a speech praising innovative ecotourism initiatives. At the center of it all stood Paula, dressed in a suit with a ribbon-cutting sash, directing workers as if she were opening a legitimate business. Meanwhile, the excavator had already begun digging near the creek exactly where Nora had warned. Crews unloaded rebar and concrete forms, clearing underbrush to make space for guest cottages promoted in the retreat brochures. The scale of coordination was staggering. Paula had mobilized an entire construction team, arranged a public dedication, and invited dignitaries, all without owning the land, securing permits, or holding any legal authority. But the most surreal moment was watching her greet guests, local business leaders, tourism officials, even someone from the county's economic development office, as though she were welcoming them to her private estate. She had somehow managed to rope in respected community leaders to attend a dedication ceremony for a business that only existed in her imagination. The sheer boldness of it all was astonishing, impressive in a way, but chilling in what it revealed about how much she thought she could get away with. That's when the cavalry arrived. 3 county vehicles rolled up to the forest entrance, lights flashing. At the front was Officer Ruiz, followed closely by a building inspector and a representative from the county assessor's office. The excavator operator spotted the official convoy first and immediately killed his engine, clearly sensing that things were about to take a very bad turn for everyone on site. "Ladies and gentlemen," the building inspector's voice rang out over a portable megaphone. "This event is hereby shut down due to unpermitted activity on disputed land. All equipment must be removed at once, and everyone needs to vacate the area." The reaction from Paula's guests was swift and predictable: confused whispers, frantic phone calls, and a mad scramble back toward their cars as it dawned on them that they had been invited to take part in an illegal construction project. But that was only the beginning. While the inspector was cataloging violations and Officer Ruiz collected statements from the crew, the county assessor approached me with a clipboard and a look that made it clear he was carrying important news. "Mr. Porter," he said, "we've completed the boundary survey you requested, and there's something significant you need to know about the property lines." What he showed me next was the knockout blow I hadn't seen coming. According to the official survey, Paula's very own HOA clubhouse foundation extended 12 feet onto my land, the same building where she had been holding meetings, charging residents fees, and exercising authority as HOA president wasn't entirely hers. It was partially built on property I owned. She had been running her operation from a structure that was, itself, illegally constructed. The irony was so sharp it felt staged. While Paula had spent weeks fighting me over access rights and claiming that my forest belonged to the community, her power base was literally sitting on stolen ground. The clubhouse that gave her legitimacy was trespassing on land that belonged to me. Every HOA meeting, every decision, every dollar collected in that space had taken place on my property without my permission. The moment the assessor laid this out, Paula's composure collapsed. The confident authority she had clung to through weeks of forged paperwork, legal posturing, and fraudulent schemes disintegrated right there in public. She stood in her ribbon-cutting sash, surrounded by embarrassed community leaders, as the foundation of her entire operation crumbled around her. "This is impossible," she kept repeating, staring at the survey papers as if willing them to change. "That clubhouse has stood for 15 years. The HOA built it with permits. community property, but the county assessor wasn't swayed. Boundaries are boundaries, and the survey stakes didn't lie. The reporters, who had shown up to cover a triumphant ribbon cutting, suddenly realized they had a much bigger story on their hands. Officer Ruiz calmly explained that, moving forward, the HOA would require my written permission to continue using their own clubhouse. The same woman who had spent weeks trying to seize control of my forest was now forced to stand on my property and ask me for access to her own building. The shift was instant. The tourism board representative quietly peeled off his name tag and made for his car. A local politician who had been ready to deliver a speech about innovative community development suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. Within the hour, Paula's victory lap had unraveled into a public disaster. Captured by cameras from every angle, I presented my 3 pieces of evidence to Officer Ruiz and the assembled officials. The buried concrete markers proving my property. Lines, records of Paula's fraudulent fee collection exceeding $3,000, and the unpermitted retreat project she had been selling to paying customers. When reporters pressed her on the so-called trail maintenance fees, Paula inadvertently confirmed that she had been charging residents for upkeep of land she didn't even own. "I'm not in your HOA," I told her plainly, as she stood by watching county officials log violations and trespassing charges. "I never was, and now you're standing on my land, asking for permission you'll never get." Everyone nearby heard me, and more than a few began snapping photos of the survey markers and heavy equipment being hauled off the site. No arrests were made, but Officer Ruiz ordered Paula to cease all unauthorized activity immediately and remove any signage or equipment from my property. The most symbolic moment came when Paula herself had to take down one of her HOA property signs. Cameras rolling the entire time. The woman who had tried to claim my forest with forged documents and midnight evidence planting was now following my instructions about what could and couldn't remain on land I legally owned. The crowd dispersed quickly, leaving behind the wreckage of Paula's failed dedication ceremony and the bright survey stakes that marked where her retreat center would never stand. Walking through the forest later that afternoon, I saw the damage firsthand, but I also knew her scheme had finally been exposed in the most public way possible. Her attempted land grab hadn't just failed. It had backfired so spectacularly it would become local legend. And Paula was about to learn the hard way that actions carry consequences. Over the following weeks, those consequences came down like clockwork. County officials hit her with triple penalties for fraudulent fee collection, over $9,000 in fines, and restitution to residents. Her Woodland Luxury Retreats LLC registration was revoked. She faced further charges for taking deposits without ownership or permits. But the most satisfying outcome was the collapse of her HOA empire. Residents voted her out of every position, restructuring the leadership entirely. They put in new financial oversight rules to prevent another scam like hers. Nora stepped up as interim president, bringing honesty and transparency the neighborhood had been missing. The very first issue she addressed, the clubhouse trespassing problem. Because Paula's clubhouse foundation sat 12 feet on my land, the HOA would now require my formal permission to use their own building, not just once every year. It wasn't just legal compliance, it was a reminder of who actually held authority over the land. The new board approached me respectfully with a request for what they called a shared access agreement. My reply was generous but firm. I granted use of the clubhouse at the symbolic cost of $1 per year, on the condition that the HOA help maintain conservation standards on the forest trails. Crossing both properties, the agreement covered wildlife protection, environmental care, and community education on forest stewardship. Paula's fraudulent retreat plan had been replaced by a legitimate conservation partnership. The restitution process became a kind of community celebration. Residents were reimbursed for the bogus maintenance fees, with records posted publicly for accountability. Nora even pinned a reimbursement schedule on the community board while Paula looked on. Stripped of every ounce of authority. It was justice so neat it felt like poetry. But her deepest humiliation still lay ahead. On the anniversary of my property purchase, Paula herself brought me the first annual clubhouse access form. It required her signature, her personal acknowledgement of my legal ownership. Beneath part of their building, her hands trembled as she signed, neighbors watching the moment of symbolic surrender. Maybe the real lesson is that boundaries aren't just legal, they're personal. And if someone keeps crossing yours, you either enforce them or they'll be defined for you. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Ever had neighbors who couldn't respect property lines? And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, you can always tap that little thanks button. Take care of your space. And if you've got trees, protect them. I'll be doing the same, just a little farther down the trail. We're QA Stories, and this is only one of many unbelievable tales. Check out the next one.